Joe Biden was not a friend to immigrants, and he deported more people than Trump has been able to in the same amount of time in office. As an immigration attorney, I have not been satisfied with any party's approach to immigration. I think the best opportunity we had for immigration reform was actually a number of years ago when Marco Rubio was leading that charge. George Bush was famous for having said human rights don't stop at the border. Historically, Ronald Reagan was fantastic at acknowledging and understanding the contributions that immigrants can make in our country. This is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. This is an American issue. Being a nation of immigrants is a foundational value of our country, and it is also a foundational value of Alaska as an inclusive, welcoming state.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance, and today our guest is the Executive Director of the ACLU of Alaska and former First Lady of Anchorage, Dr. Mayor Kimmel. Prior to taking the helm of the ACLU Alaska in 2022, she had a long career in Alaskan public policy focused on rights and justice in northern communities. She has served on the faculty at the Seattle University School of Law, the University of Alaska Anchorage, and Alaska Pacific University. Most relevant to our conversation today, Dr. Kimmel worked for over a decade as an immigration attorney and as an advocate for tribal subsistence rights. In her role as First Lady of Anchorage as wife to Mayor Ethan Berkowitz, she led the development of welcoming and resilience initiatives at the Municipality of Anchorage. She serves on the National Board of Directors for Welcoming America, the Regional Advisory Board for the Anti-Defamation League, and is a board member and co-founder of the Alaska Institute for Justice. Mayor earned her PhD in Environmental Science and Policy from Central University in Budapest in 2014. Mayor Kimmel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in New York City, and then my parents fled west, so I was raised in California. I grew up in the East Bay area of San Francisco, had a fabulous upbringing in some absolutely gorgeous country.
Did you come from a large family?
I am one of three. I'm the oldest of three. I was raised by a single mom. So we grew up pretty close to the poverty line in a very wealthy community in California. So it really kind of started my awareness of what it's like to feel outside of a system and a situation. And I think that was one of my biggest impetuses to then go work on issues like civil rights and human rights, is recognizing the inequities that exist in the world.
Did you always want to be a lawyer?
No. In fact, I was going to go be a scholar and a teacher because I found I wasn't a fan of school growing up, but I found when I hit college and when I was able to study issues that intrigued me, I fell in love with the whole college system and the whole system of education and liberal arts. And so that really motivated me, and my intent was to go be a professor.
What did your mom do?
My mom was a housewife when my parents first got divorced and then was forced to go back into the workforce. And she was a teacher prior to getting married. So she was a high school special ed teacher growing up. And education is a huge part of my family. My sister is a teacher here in Anchorage in special ed as well. And so it's a profession that I just dearly respect. And it's something that means the world to me in terms of people's opportunities to explore their potential through education systems.
How old were you when your parents got a divorce?
I was 9.
Do you remember it?
Very, very vividly. Yeah. And being the oldest too, I really took over a more of a quasi-parental role with my siblings. And so it was difficult and challenging, not only because we were then dealing with life living on a poverty line, but also just we were one of the first divorces in my neighborhood. This was at a time when divorce was just beginning to happen with families.
It was more scandalous.
It was scandalous. It was very unusual and unique.
Did you have a relationship with your dad?
Yes. And now I have a great relationship with my dad. Growing up, it was a little rocky, but now he's wonderful.
What does your dad do?
He was a physician. And now he's a retired physician living in Oregon, and we are very close now.
What kind of physician?
A pediatrician. Yeah.
Your dad was a doctor, your mom was a teacher. Were there any examples of attorneys in your family?
None.
Did your parents, did they support you going into law?
Funny, my dad was disappointed when I went into law because doctors and lawyers often don't get along. But I think now he's happy. And it's really nice to watch. I come from a very progressive family. They are very politically to the left. And so they're both very proud of where I've ended up now, heading the ACLU of Alaska affiliate.
Were your parents religious?
No, my parents, I joke with my parents that they were fundamentalist atheists. But culturally, I was raised very Jewish, and I continue to really align my value system with my Jewish cultural background.
So you came up to Alaska your sophomore year of college.
Yes.
Why?
I was looking for adventure. I fled north at 19. So I basically have lived on and off in Alaska since 1984. Like most of us in Alaska who are not from here, I was drawn to Alaska. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I came up for a summer, and 41 years later, I'm still here.
For a job? No.
Just seriously for adventure. And I actually went to Fairbanks. So I came to Alaska, spent a summer exploring. I had an adventure on Birch Creek, Alaska, which is in the interior. It's a tributary of the Yukon River where I got stuck out there for 7 days in the wilderness.
By yourself?
I was with somebody else who we don't need to talk about, but we got stuck out there, and a plane landed on the other side of the river, and the river had been at flood stage. And so the pilot, it was a small plane, he said, "Do you want to cross the river and I can take you out?" And we said, "No, thank you." And he said, "Okay, great, I'll send somebody else." And he never did. And so days later, there were 2 canoes that floated by us, and I ran out there and flagged them down, and they became my best friends for life. I still owe those 4 men my life and my sanity, and they took us off the river. And so after that experience, I just felt very wedded to Alaska, and I tried to go back to California after that, but I realized I was so distracted by everything Alaska had to offer that I came back for a year, worked. I actually did a semester at UAF in political science, which I'm so grateful for because the professors I had there still mean the world to me, and I'm still in touch with the ones who are still alive. And they really set my career off on a great trajectory. But I eventually went back to California, finished undergraduate school, and then came back to
Where'd you graduate from?
UC Berkeley.
And so you graduated from UC Berkeley, and did you go straight to law school?
No, I came back to Alaska. I got a master's degree at UAF in natural resource management. I started there in 1988 and worked with the villages in the Prince William Sound as part of an internship. And then the following spring, the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened. So they called me back to work with, it was called the North Pacific Rim, which is the regional nonprofit organization. It's now Chugach-Mute. So I worked with those communities that were impacted by the oil spill for about a year. And then I went and worked with an organization that I was part of creating called the Alaska Sea Otter Commission. That was modeled after the Eskimo Whaling Commission and the Eskimo Walrus Commission. So I really got interested in working on tribal self-governance and working on natural resource management. And eventually, much later, got a PhD looking at natural resource management and tribal governance and tribal sovereignty.
Oh, you have a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
I'm confessing to my listeners that I ran in this morning as unprepared for any interview I've ever done. So, Dr.
Great.
Meredith.
Yes, that was fun. I got my doctorate while I was teaching at UAA in political science, and I actually attended a school that used to be based out of Budapest, Hungary, Central European University, and has since had to move because of Viktor Orban and his clampdown. He forced the school to move because of their emphasis on gender studies and migration. And so they are now located in Vienna.
When did law school happen?
Law school happened before that.
Okay.
So I was working for these tribes on tribal self-governance and quickly realized that if I was to do anything meaningful with that work, I'd either have to be a biologist or a lawyer. And biology was not my strong suit. So I left Alaska for a few years in the mid-90s and went out to the University of Minnesota Law School. And so did that and then moved back. I started in Fairbanks, but I moved after law school back to Anchorage.
When did you meet your husband?
I met him in 1998 at the Fly-By-Night bar. He had just finished his first term as a state legislator.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So he ran as a single man the first time.
Yes, he ran as a single man the first time, and then that was it. Yeah.
So you met in 98.
Yep.
And when did y'all get married?
2000. Yeah, so 2 years later.
And how many kids do you have?
2. And my youngest just graduated from college this weekend. So I was just down in Eugene, Oregon. Thank you. Yep, it was much more emotional than I thought. Yeah.
And I guess I'm fascinated by, I guess, power couples that both have their own big trajectories, because that's not my experience. My husband is not interested in politics. He is definitely the introvert, stay-at-home type. And so I feel like I just have like the support base to do whatever I want.
Yeah.
I guess Jane Ambick and Vic Fisher would be an example of another couple where they both had their own independent, amazing careers happening simultaneously. But what Jane will tell you is that, that there were terrible times.
Oh, yeah.
Because when she was running for lieutenant governor and he was running for the Senate reelection that he lost, that was absolute chaos in their household.
Yeah. No, it is very trying. I'm envious of you and your husband. When Ethan first got elected mayor, I remember I was with him at a conference, and the mayor of Boise said to me, as a spouse, you're either all in or all out. It's really hard to be either one. And so just our interests, Ethan's and my interests, historically have just aligned. We're very similar people in the motivations that we have to do the work that we do. And so it was really hard not to participate. And I think I was very, very involved in his mayorship and worked a lot at that point on a lot of policy around becoming a more welcoming community and becoming a more resilient community. And prior to Ethan becoming mayor, I had worked with a group of students to create a climate action plan for the city. So when he became mayor, we brought that approach in as well. So I think during his mayorship, the two big pieces I worked on, like I said, were welcoming and resilience. And those are things I'm exceptionally proud of having been able to do. And I was very, very engaged in making sure that our community could reflect the diversity and the talents of the people who were here. And I'm still absolutely committed to that work and always will be, no matter what my position is.
You worked on immigration law?
Yes. I was an immigration lawyer for about 10 years.
Okay. Tell us about that experience.
So when I came back from law school, I worked actually with a law firm here who had represented the tribes that I'd worked with prior to going to law school. So that's what brought me back to Alaska. And
so you had like an in because you knew the people.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love that work. And again, I was able to do some natural resource work. At the time, the Violence Against Women Act had just passed. And there was a provision in that act that allowed for immigrant victims of domestic violence to get status on their own without requiring the participation of their abusive U.S. citizen spouse. And so that door opened wide. And in Alaska, as you might imagine, that was a really relevant issue for non-citizen spouses, victims of domestic violence. So I started doing pro bono work with Catholic Social Services, and my hero / mentor / dearest friend, Robin Bronin, who was working as the director of the Immigration and Refugee Services program at Catholic Social Services. I came to work one day. There was a huge article about her in the Anchorage Daily News. I contacted her, and we became fast friends, and I became an Uber volunteer doing a lot of pro bono work with her, to the point where she offered me a job, and my law firm at the time said, we'd love to have a pro bono person, but we can't really afford it. So it was a great moment to transition. So I left after 2 years of private lawyering and went into nonprofit work and worked with mostly immigrant victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, but also did a lot of work with asylum seekers, people who were looking to reunify with family members. At the time, we had been resettling refugees from the former Yugoslav conflict, and we didn't have a state refugee coordinator then. So Robin really worked hard with the state of Alaska and with Catholic Social Services and became the first state refugee coordinator. Prior to that, we didn't have that kind of functional system. So I got to witness that. I was also there at the time. There was a law in 2000 that was passed by the U.S. Congress that allowed immigrant crime victims and human trafficking victims to also get legal status in the United States. And that was brand new. And in fact, Alaska was the site of the first prosecution of human trafficking under that 2000 statute. There's a great story about then INS driving by the Crazy Horse Saloon, and on the marquee it said Russian dancers. And so they pulled off, went into the Crazy Horse, and arrested all of the Russian women that were dancing there. And the INS attorney at the time said, there's this new law that just passed. we're not going to prosecute those women. We're going to prosecute the traffickers. And that was the first prosecution in the country under that new law.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
It was great.
We talk about Anchorage being super diverse, and East High School is in my district, the most diverse high school in the country. But I know from having Issa Spatrosano on, just the numbers of the refugees that we brought in has historically been pretty small,
Yep.
like in terms of the raw numbers.
Yep.
So I guess common sense would dictate that we have a lot more immigrants coming into
Absolutely.
Alaska than just through the refugee system.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. I think that people, the term immigrant is just, it includes refugees, but so all refugees are immigrants, but not all immigrants are refugees. And in fact, historically, prior to the Ukraine conflict, we've had very, very few refugees in our state. We've done an amazing job, and Issa has done an incredible job at really elevating the visibility and presence and meaningful interactions between the refugee community and the rest of Alaska. But it's such a small percentage of newcomers.
Mm-hmm.
The state's overall newcomer population is about 7.5% of the state's overall population. And I think refugees account for just a minute number of
Part of a percent.
Yeah. So I think the raw numbers are we have about 25,000 foreign-born Alaskans. And at the highest point, we've resettled about 1,000 refugees per year.
How did you get to the ACLU?
After working with Catholic Social Services, they closed the program, and it then became later the program that Issa has been guiding, the Refugee Assistance and Immigration Services program. But when I was working there, they closed the existing legal service program. So I took the opportunity, reconnected with my professors who I'd met at UAF, and they had a job open at UAA. So I became a political science professor and worked there for about 10 years as a full-on professor, and then about 5 more as an adjunct. And I'd started working with the court system on access to justice issues. We have an amazing court system that is promoting the ways that people who don't have the opportunity to get lawyers can access justice for themselves. There's an incredible self-help center that the court system offers that provides all kinds of legal resources. And so I did a lot of work with the court system to make sure that those resources are available for people. And in fact, we're trying to make sure that those resources are available now to incarcerated Alaskans too. The work that I did there was very much based on understanding that we have an overwhelming number of civil legal needs for Alaskans, not an overwhelming number of lawyers. And so we need to fill that gap. And we've been very creative in doing that. So I did that for a few years. I worked when Ethan was in office on this, the welcoming work and the resilience work. And then the position at the ACLU of Alaska opened up, and I applied. And after a long, lengthy application process, I took the job in May of 2022. So I've been there for about 3 years. And it's been phenomenal because of the people I work with. Number one, we have an incredible team, and we've about doubled in size since I've gotten there. The ACLU of Alaska has historically ebbed and flowed in terms of size. We didn't have any paid staff until about 1990, even though we existed since the 1970s. And there are tremendous justice needs in our state. And so my intent in taking the position was to really strengthen the internal capacity of the organization so that we could extend our external reach much more broadly through the state and really start to help fill some of the ecosystem needs that exist in the justice ecosystem.
I want to say something about the ACLU. I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, that sort of time period, the ACLU defending far-right extremist groups' rights to protest and basically disappointing their progressive base over and over by going to bat for neo-Nazi groups and things like that to give them, their right to free speech and to protest. Can you speak to their approach?
Sure. So I think the ACLU is the country's oldest civil rights organization. We're over 100 years old. So there's obviously been a great deal of transformation. I think the best way for me to think about the ACLU as an organization is that the Constitution is our client. And there are often times that there are provisions in the Constitution that require safeguarding that may not be popular amongst whatever sort of network you happen to be working with at the time. And there's been a lot of work in the First Amendment universe to really strengthen our First Amendment rights to protest and to speech. And that's been such a historic piece of what National ACLU has been all about. And so I think in those moments, they don't make a lot of friends. There's a really famous case in Skokie, Illinois, when a Jewish attorney was defending the rights of the Nazis to march through a neighborhood where there were a lot of Holocaust survivors. But it was because of this belief in the sanctity of our Constitution that propelled that lawyer to take on that case. And so, again, I think just looking at the origin and the mission of the organization is really critical. I will say, though, one of the things that I really appreciate about being an affiliate organization of a big national organization is we have tremendous autonomy in our state to do what we see fit. And so another one of my motivations, I will say I'm the first executive director of the affiliate here that is from Alaska. Everybody else was brought up to Alaska and has since left Alaska. This is my home. It is a place I'm extraordinarily committed to. This is, being the executive director of this organization is a step in a long career that I've had in this state dedicated to justice and rights, human and civil rights. And so what I really hoped to bring to the organization is a very Alaskan approach to the way that we do civil rights. And so what that has meant to me is we take a look again at what Alaska's justice ecosystem is. And we work with our partners to fill those gaps. Very, very sparse. Our social service and legal service organizations in Alaska, I like to describe as a mile wide and an inch deep. We really need each other as social justice organizations to be able to come together and work to protect and promote human and civil rights for Alaskans. And the ACLU really needs to be a part of that ecosystem. And so that has been my major motivation, is that we are led by and informed by the needs of Alaskans. And we have very unique civil and human rights needs. And one great example, of course, is just the rich history and network of Alaska Native organizations and the unique needs that Alaska Native communities have and the different ways that justice is defined in those communities as opposed to, for example, immigrant and refugee communities or Black communities. And so the ability to bring those issues together and really have those issues define our mission and our vision and values has been really critical.
I want to talk now about sort of the issues in front of us. And this will be airing after we've had our hearing on Friday about ICE detainees being held by the Department of Corrections in Alaska. And I'm going to make some confessions. When I first started working on the hearing, I had a question that's going to sound pretty embarrassing for the chair of House Judiciary, but I literally was like, well, are they protected by our Bill of Rights? Does every person have these rights, or do you need to be a citizen to have these rights? Can you answer that question?
Yeah, and I think that is a fantastic question, and no shame in that. I think we don't understand generally who the Constitution applies to. And yes, of course, people would think it applies only to citizens. The 14th Amendment, though, really started, when it said all persons are subject to equal protection of the laws, it really opened up the applicability of the Constitution to people who are living within the United States or on U.S. soil, not necessarily who are born of. But I will say there are definite limitations to the kinds of rights that are applicable to non-citizens. And so it is the essence of the constitutional principles that are applicable. So it's things like you have a right to due process. And that's really the big one. In terms of my own career, I think one thing that has been really interesting is I have worked with Indigenous communities and immigrant communities. And after decades of working with both, one thing that has become very clear to me is both of those communities are uniquely defined by statute and by Constitution to a degree that me as a non-immigrant, non-Indigenous person, I am not defined nearly to the same extent by law, but every right that people have as an Indigenous person or as an immigrant is defined by the Constitution. And those rights are easily taken away. And so it's really incumbent upon allied organizations and allied institutions to make sure that people who are within the immigrant community or the indigenous community, we're watching and we're making sure that those rights are upheld. And the reason that that's relevant to this particular question is people, no matter where you're born, but if you are in the United States, you do have fundamental rights of due process.
Can you define in simple language what due process is?
Due process essentially means that you have a right to be heard. You have a right to know what the process is. So, for example, for an immigrant, if you are in this country and they want to kick you out, you have a right to a process to be kicked out. So you have a right to present a defense to being kicked out. And what's interesting, and I think a lot of people also don't understand, is when you present yourself at a U.S. border and say, I want to apply for political asylum, that is a right that is in both international human rights law, but also in our U.S. Constitution. So the people coming across the southern border into the U.S. did exactly the lawful thing that they needed to do. So they are lawfully entering the United States when they're saying, I want to claim political asylum. These are not illegals. These are people who are claiming that opportunity to request asylum under both U.S. and international law. So that's also something that's not widely understood. And so when we're talking about due process rights for foreign-born folks, it is either the right to apply for asylum and the right to go through that process, or it is the right to defend yourself against being deported. And so what happens when you are detained and flown out of the country secretly is you're denied that due process.
Which we've seen with the planes going to El Salvador,
Exactly.
to Sudan,
Yeah.
to Rwanda.
Yeah. And there's one last thing I will say, which is it's also really important to understand that people who are in the United States without authorization, whether that's because they entered the country without being inspected by an immigration officer or they've overstayed their visa, those folks are committing a civil violation. They are not committing a criminal violation. So that's another instance of when the Constitution doesn't apply. Because this is a civil matter, you don't have a right to a court-appointed lawyer. Some of your rights to self-incrimination apply differently because it's a civil matter, not a criminal matter. So there's also that distinction that people need to keep in mind.
My basic understanding is that because it's a civil matter, it's really more of a Fifth Amendment issue, not an Eighth Amendment issue. That you're the lawyer.
Yeah.
So I see that perplexing look on your face. But they have a right to due process. But the Eighth Amendment, which would say protects people from
Cruel and
unusual punishment, they shouldn't be being punished.
That's an interesting
They
take.
shouldn't be being punished. And therefore, that doesn't apply because there should be no punishment applied. This is an administrative hold. They're being held administratively until their immigration hearing. Some of the reading that I did said that therefore they should have even greater access toward ankle monitoring or sort of home detention, because this is just about making sure that they go to their immigration hearing.
Yeah.
It's not about enforcing any sort of punitive measures.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. However, I do think that what is happening right now at the Anchorage Correctional Center amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. So if you take a population that shouldn't be subject to punishment in the first place, it doesn't necessarily deny that they have an Eighth Amendment right again to prevent that. But what it does do is it would force our criminal legal system to acknowledge and understand that criminal punishment is not the right approach, that there should be some civil remedies to this.
I believe I'll have a lot more knowledge about the individuals being held after the hearing. But I do know that some of them have been charged with crimes. And there were some suggestions that when they decided which folks would be flown to Alaska, that there may have been an effort to choose folks who had some criminal history to just take some of this off the table. But I also know that some of them don't have any charges of criminal activity. And I also want to say a lot of these folks have been held for longer than Trump's been in office. At least one of them that I know of was ICE detainee in Tacoma for 3.5 years. A question that has been asked by several other legislators about this hearing why do we hold people in ICE detention for 3.5 years at an expense to the American taxpayer? Like, just looking at it from a fiscally responsible position, why would we not be moving towards having these immigration hearings in a more timely manner than just keeping someone in a facility at the U.S. taxpayer expense for years?
So there's a lot in what you just said. And the first thing I want to suggest is if a person commits a crime in a state, they go through that criminal proceeding, they serve their time, justice is meted out through that state criminal proceeding. That is a wholly separate thing than an immigration removal proceeding. And so once you're done serving your time and you're getting deported, you're moving over into an entirely different system and structure where, again, the statement about people who are here might be criminals does not then justify treating them as criminals because they are being civilly detained now as they're executing the deportation warrant. So they're two very different proceedings, and we shouldn't confuse the two. So even though we have people who are being deported on criminal grounds, they're not being held because they're criminals. They're being held by a civil deportation proceeding. So those are very, very distinct. And so the rights that apply to ICE detainees apply whether or not you're there because you've committed some criminal acts or because you've overstayed your visa. So that's the first just point of clarification. We need to treat those as very distinct processes.
I think I pointed it out because for some members of the public, if someone has likely raped a minor, for example, the idea that, that we're going to try to protect their right to stay in the country, it just isn't it. And I understand from a legal perspective, but I'm just saying in terms of public opinion, that is a harder case for me as a politician to argue.
Absolutely. I understand that. And there's all kinds of sympathetic things. And that is why we have a criminal legal system, is because those people go through that criminal legal system and then pay the debt that they owe to society. And then on top of that, they're getting deported. So both of those things can be true. One doesn't negate the other. So I absolutely understand that. And we have a system of laws in this nation, which we hope are applicable to everybody and anybody. And it is really, the rule of law is fundamental to making sure that we have a functional democracy. And so when we have those rules in place, those rules contemplate criminal actions done by non-citizens, and they account for that. And those rules are still in place, no matter, again, how you come into this situation. So I think that my answer as an attorney is we do need to respect the rule of law, and we need to do that because our democracy is at stake. Even when it is abhorrent, when somebody has done an abhorrent thing, we need to trust that our legal system addresses those issues. And we're removing them from the U.S. So we're taking care of the problem because we've punished them for the crime. And then the second phase is to remove them from the United States. It will be interesting to find out more about who is actually being detained at ACC. We do not know that. We have been trying to send attorneys in to ACC to meet with the detainees, and we have been unsuccessful. We have been turned away at ACC, and people are being denied their right to counsel as a result. We are trying to find out who's in there and for what. I also know that there's a person in there who had a grant of political asylum. That's currently on appeal. The U.S. government took appeal, but that person was granted by an immigration judge the right to stay here. So I do think it's going to be a lot more of a complicated population than just people who were selected because they're criminals. I think there are a lot of folks in there who've overstayed visas, who have family ties to the United States, who have been granted immigration relief that may be now under appeal by the U.S. government, but an underlying immigration judge saw the justification to allow them to remain.
Right. Well, that's the Russian man who had been the victim of an assault in Russia because he's gay. I mean, I read the Seattle Times report.
Okay.
And what's been brought up is that it's very unusual that he would be granted asylum and then the U.S. government would appeal. I mean, what happened
No,
there?
that's not unusual.
That's not
at
unusual.
all.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah,
like,
sure.
Why is it under appeal?
So I practiced immigration law in front of immigration courts for many, many years. And when I would win, the government would oftentimes just file an appeal so that they would preserve their right to contest that if they chose to. Sometimes the government wouldn't follow through on it and the appeal would just fade away because they wouldn't follow through. But it's very common to lose at the administrative law judge level and then appeal to the administrative appellate agency.
And again, like, I just want to say for the record, that all happened under Biden, like that appeal and his asylum.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is not something happening because of the Trump administration.
Right.
And I just say that because there's a lot of accusations that I'm doing an anti-Trump hearing. But I'm acknowledging that these folks, most of them became ICE detainees under Biden, not Trump.
Absolutely. And I will also say that Joe Biden was not a friend to immigrants, and he deported more people than Trump has been able to in the same amount of time in office. He was really cracking down on the border, despite the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that people have a legal right to claim asylum. That was not part of Biden's approach. As an immigration attorney, I have not been satisfied with any party's approach to immigration. I think the best opportunity we had for immigration reform was actually a number of years ago when Marco Rubio was leading that charge. So it's really not a partisan issue. George Bush was famous for having said human rights don't stop at the border. Historically, Ronald Reagan was fantastic at acknowledging and understanding the contributions that immigrants can make in our country. This is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. This is an American issue. Being a nation of immigrants is a foundational value of our country, and it is also a foundational value of Alaska as an inclusive, welcoming state. It's not a partisan issue.
To get back to concerns about Alaska housing immigration and custom enforcement detainees, have we done this before?
As far as I'm aware, no. So we have an agreement with the federal government that allows, if an Alaskan immigrant is picked up, as you said, maybe for a criminal violation or they've overstayed a visa and they're picked up by ICE and placed into removal proceedings, which happen all the time. That's why I made my living as an immigration lawyer. These folks could be held at a state facility for up to 48 hours while they were waiting to be transferred to the nearest ICE facility, which is in Tacoma, Washington. Alaska does not have an ICE detention facility. So we're very used to people being picked up in the state and then sent out. What we are not used to is having people sent back to Alaska.
Gotcha. How do we transport an ICE detainee from Anchorage to Tacoma? I mean, because this has been brought up a lot about what kinds of flights are these and who's paying for those flights?
Yeah.
And, is it somebody being escorted on a commercial flight? Is it somebody being on some sort of chartered plane?
So back in my day, which was a long time ago now, people were escorted on commercial flights with a U.S. Marshal. And so I would frequently board a flight and there'd be somebody in, I forget whatever colors they would wear and handcuffed and being sent out to Tacoma. We think we know that the people who were brought here were on a Coast Guard airplane. But again, we don't have a lot of transparency or information from the state DOC as to how this transfer has been facilitated.
And I believe, and I could get these numbers wrong, that 40 were sent up, but then one was sent back. So we have 39.
I've heard that 42 were brought up, 2 were sent back immediately, and I think 1 has also since been sent back. So maybe now we have 39. Again, there's not a lot of transparency, not a lot of accountability from either ICE or DOC. So there's just so much confusion surrounding who is actually being held, under what conditions are they being held, at what cost are they being held, which is why we're very grateful that there is going to be a judiciary hearing to help us understand how this transpired.
And one concern that I've heard voiced is that this isn't, the list of detainees has folks from countries from all over the world and all different languages.
Yes.
And we know that there's an issue with limited English proficiency from multiple detainees. And the article that came out a couple of days ago about the hearing basically said that DOC said, no, we have translation services. We have multiple folks who work in DOC who speak different languages. We have no issues with language access. But that's not what we've heard from lawyers who've met with the detainees.
That's correct. And so in addition to DOC and every single state agency having a responsibility to provide language access under the Civil Rights Act, Every single state agency that I'm aware of falls flat under that obligation. That has been a passion area of mine and of others in the state to provide and ensure linguistically accessible services. We've never hit that at all. So DOC has that obligation. ICE also has that obligation. And what we are hearing from detainees in the limited amount that we can hear from them is that language access has not been provided. When you are oriented into the facility, you're supposed to be given that orientation in a language you understand, and you're supposed to be given translated materials. That has not happened as far as we know. And as far as we know, people are not able to access interpreters. And DOC, if in fact they are providing interpreters, and I read in the same article, they're using a online language interpreter center or language interpreter service. We have non-detainee clients, prisoners who are being held at DOC who do not have access to interpreters. We've had to, at our own expense, create resources for people who are incarcerated in Alaskan facilities in different languages because those resources are not provided by DOC, even though they should be.
You brought up something that I want to highlight, and that is that we're probably not the only DOC facility in the country that is not meeting this standard.
Correct.
But the fact that other people are doing it doesn't make it okay.
Correct.
And I wanted to mention that's my understanding that the Tacoma ICE detainee facility being full, that some folks have been transported to Hawaii and California.
Yes.
So again, it's not a red state, blue state issue in terms of where are these folks being sent. But it's my understanding that they did go to ICE, federal ICE facilities in Hawaii and California.
Yes.
So that makes it different.
Yes. We are the only state that is housing people in a state-run facility, not a federal-run facility. And that does make things different. And we are very concerned about the conditions of confinement because the ACLU of Alaska has another class action suit against DOC because of their failure to provide adequate medical services. And so we're really concerned about the medical services that are being provided to the detainees, in particular the mental health services that are being provided, because these folks have no tie to Alaska. It's not like they were living here and ICE decided to bring back Alaskans who are in removal proceedings. That's not at all the case. These 40 folks have no ties to Alaska. They are far away from family. If they have lawyers, they're in the lower 48. And what we've heard from all accounts from some of the detainees is that people are seriously suffering some mental health issues. And it's really, really important for us to remember, again, these are not people who are accused of crimes. These are people who are committing ostensibly civil violations. These are not criminal detainees. These are civil detainees.
This is an administrative hold to make sure they attend their immigration hearing.
Yep, exactly.
I want to talk about, I believe, what happened on June 12th. I spoke with a family member of a detainee yesterday. So I know that this is that person's, what they relate. So I don't know what DOC is going to say to this, but that a detainee was asking about their property that had been detained in Washington. And according to this family member, 5 minutes later, she called it a pepper bomb was released on the detainees who were not in their cells, but were in a confined space. And pepper bomb, I think it means tear gas, that they were tear gassed indoors. I have since done some research on the use of tear gas in detention facilities. It's something that happens in other states. It's very controversial. The purpose of tear gas, from my understanding, for law enforcement is that it's a way to disperse a crowd. They need a path of egress. They need a way to get out. When you do it indoors with no way to move, it's called kettling. It's seen as punitive. This is a punishment, which again, they're not supposed to be subject to punishment because they haven't been convicted of a crime and they're not incarcerated for that reason. I then understand that they went into lockdown, I think 2 separate lockdowns, but ultimately the person I spoke to said that her family member was unable to shower for at least 3 days, unable to change clothes. So they had the tear gas on them. And when she spoke to the detainee, she heard lots of coughing in the background. This is a known effect of exposure to tear gas, is respiratory irritation. And I don't know if you have more knowledge about like that firsthand.
The only things I would add is that it was an individual who wanted to contact his consular official, which is absolutely a right that ICE detainees have no matter where they are. And in fact, the state has an obligation to provide that information in case a person wants to contact their consular official, was asking for their property because that property included ways to contact the consular official. And the only other fact I heard, in addition to what you just described, is that they then tear gassed the lunchroom where everybody was eating, and they had to sit in that tear gas for about an hour. One of the detainees was on oxygen. And so I do think that oxygen was provided for that person, but I'm not entirely clear. I also know that DOC does have policies in place for tear gas. I'm not as familiar with those policies yet. But I know that our staff is.
Well, according to the limited research that I've done, take it with a grain of salt, is that it's normally used in a DOC facility to stop a riot or to prevent imminent harm from one inmate to another or self-harm. Like, if there's like people about to kill each other, this is the way you stop it.
Yeah.
But from the family member I spoke to, she said that there was no rioting happening.
No.
That the detainees were not out of control. There was not any threat to the correctional officers or to the detainees amongst themselves.
Right.
That it really felt completely unprovoked and quite surprising and inexplicable to the detainees.
And I would argue cruel and unusual. And so that gets us back to Eighth Amendment protections against that. I don't know what the justification was. I don't know if this was an ICE decision or a DOC decision. It's really hard to tell who's pulling the strings in some of these decisions, like, for example, access to counsel. We've been told by ACC that we have to go through ICE to get our entries of appearance to represent somebody approved by ICE, which in all of my years of practicing immigration law, I have never had to ask the government for permission to take on a client, and it should never be that way. And so they're making up rules as we go along here to the detriment of people. And in fact, I would also echo that what we've been hearing is that these 40 folks or 39 folks have been actually very close and really supportive of each other. So this was a situation where, as far as I'm aware, one person was agitating for his right to contact a consular official and was then punished. The whole group was punished as a result. There are standards of care for ICE detainees, and one of the things I'm very eager to hear about is how these detainees were treated differently in Tacoma than they were here in Alaska. And one of the things that we've already been hearing is that the detainees in Tacoma had access to a tablet and could contact their family and their friends on a very regular basis, and they were able to work with their attorneys. That has not been the case at all in Alaska. In fact, what we've been told is folks are told they've got 2 phone calls a month that they're able to make. They're only supposed to be here for a month, which means that during the entire time they're here, they're only able to make 2 telephone calls.
Okay, well, I can just state, at least to the family member I spoke to yesterday, that she had spoken to the detainee on Thursday and then again on Sunday.
Right.
So that was 2 times in a single week.
Terrific.
So they might be getting more
That's
access.
fantastic. That is great. And we hope that that's the case. We do know that people don't have access to tablets, though, while in DOC facilities. And so that has to be an exception or something that potentially DOC would be providing.
And again, because what DOC should be recognizing is that these are not
normal.
They're general incarcerated population.
Yep.
It's a civil proceeding, not a criminal one. These aren't criminals. They are civil detainees.
Yep.
And that's different. And they should have more rights and privileges than the general incarcerated population.
And that gets to the question of cost that is really important here. One thing we do know, too, is that there's a memorandum of agreement between ICE and DOC, and that ICE is paying a per diem rate for these detainees in DOC. But if DOC is adhering to the requirements that ICE has for detainees, it's going to be more expensive. Who's paying for that? Where is that coming from in the state's budget? That's really important. The other thing that we do know, too, is typically in detention, and there are write-ups. ProPublica just did one on conditions in ICE detention around the country. It is not a picnic at all. I've been in detention facilities around the country. They're pretty abysmal. They're jails. They're not detention facilities. People are in jail. So every access is limited, but people are allowed to be in congregate spaces with one another. They have meals. They're not handcuffed while moving between spaces. That is a very different situation that is going on here, according to what we're hearing.
Right. And about the handcuffing of them to a chair in order to speak to their attorney, is that your experience as an immigration attorney? When you were doing this type of work, were they handcuffed to a chair?
No. I worked in a detention facility for a little while, and our lawyer, who is now leading this charge, has worked in detention facilities for 4 years. And so has a lot of experience with ICE detention. But my experience is people have not been handcuffed. I've been able to sit across from a table, not through a glass, and talk to folks about what their rights are and do limited rights orientations and help prep them for their asylum hearings. But it's just like you and I are sitting across the table from one another. That's what it's been like. It's not been in a visitation room with a glass between us and the inability to pass documents back and forth.
I think this has come up when I've talked to a couple of other legislators. The concern, and I think it does fall on partisan lines, whether it should or it shouldn't is another story. But, it tends to be that the more fiscally conservative just want to know why aren't they just being deported? Mm-hmm. And so I guess to get back to the timeline, how long should these folks be in ICE detention? Well, one more thing I want to say, because the family member I spoke to yesterday, her family member had been an ICE detainee for 3.5 years in the Tacoma facility and hated the Tacoma facility. Yeah. So I said, so sounds like he really didn't like the Tacoma facility, didn't like being there. How does it compare to Anchorage Correctional Complex? And she immediately was like, oh, he wants to go back to Tacoma. Mm-hmm. Like, he absolutely wants to go back to Tacoma. He does not want to be here. Yeah. It is really bad.
Yeah. And I think that's really something important, again, for people to remember is when you are in ICE detention, the statistics are that you are being deported for a civil offense, not a criminal offense. There are definitely people who are being deported for criminal offenses, but you are sitting in a detention facility, as you keep saying, awaiting an administrative hearing. Those hearings are supposed to happen with some frequency. However, there are not enough immigration judges around the country to take those hearings. And so we've had a backlog, again, that has spanned administrations. And I think it's gotten a lot worse under the Trump administration because I think people are leaving the positions of being an immigration judge. So that's going to continue to get bad. But it's essentially due to backlogs. There was a case many years ago that prohibited what was called indefinite detention. So again, if you have somebody who committed a crime, they go from they're serving their prison sentence in whatever state into detention while they're awaiting removal. Those cases can take anywhere from 6 months to 5 years. It's not unheard of, and it is because of the lack of immigration judges. There's also other issues where the countries of origin we don't have a treaty with those countries, so we cannot remove them to those countries. And there was a big case a few years ago that said, if that's the case, that we don't have a treaty, you need to have a hearing for these folks who are in detention to see if they can get out and be on an ankle monitor or some other form of supervised release. So there's an awareness that to hold people indefinitely is cruel and unusual punishment, and we need to make accommodations for that. But that has not been actually implemented because of all of these administrative obstacles, like the lack of judges and the lack of time.
It's my understanding that that's one place where citizens and non-citizens have different rights, that a citizen has a right to a speedy trial.
Yes, correct.
And there is no right to a speedy hearing.
Well, and that's the difference, again, between this being a civil proceeding and a criminal proceeding, is that if you look at the Bill of Rights, there are a whole bunch of rights that you have as an accused criminal. Because the Supreme Court many, I think a century ago, said a deportation proceeding is not a criminal proceeding, that means that all those rights that attach to you as an accused criminal do not attach here. So you don't have a right to a speedy trial. You don't have a right to a jury trial. You don't have a right to a court-appointed lawyer.
So that's interesting. So a citizen who's accused of murder in some ways has more rights than...
Oh, absolutely. Because they're a citizen. And that is the way it should be. And that's why we try to encourage people who come to this country to get on the path to citizenship, is so that they can be fully engaged and fully protected by the again, the Constitution. And this was, again, one of the foundational values of our country is that we wanted to bring people here who would contribute and then also be accountable to each other in our social contract.
Do you have any advice for folks who are in Alaska who are concerned about their own immigration status?
Absolutely. Go find an immigration attorney. That is a huge issue, though. We have very, very few immigration attorneys in our state. And this gets back to the access to justice gap I mentioned earlier. It's really profound for immigration issues. We have, I think, I don't know, maybe 6 to 10 practicing private attorneys, and they're really expensive. This is a highly specialized field of law, really confusing. The stakes are incredibly high. And so the people who've been practicing in this field have developed expertises that they're getting paid for. We have one organization in the state that provides pro bono services for immigrants called the Alaska Institute for Justice, but they're booked. They don't have a lot more room. And so we're also trying to work to create training pathways for attorneys who are non-immigration lawyers, but who do want to help. And so what we've been able to do is get 27 folks, attorneys, to volunteer to be able to go into ACC to at least talk to the people there. And then we're also hoping in this time of the Trump era, when immigrants and refugees are rightly terrified about their ability to remain in the United States with their families and in jobs that they've been participating in and within communities that they've been actively engaged, we're really trying hard to make sure that they can have somebody to talk to about what their rights are and how to protect those rights. And at the ACLU of Alaska, we've been doing a series of Know Your Rights presentations for folks. So even if we can't individually represent them, we are trying to equip people with the knowledge that they need in order to be able to say, hey, this is my right.
And if people are interested in attending one of those, they find it on your website?
Absolutely. We've got a whole host of resources on our website, including family safety planning documents that will help people who are at risk of deportation make sure that their families are protected when and if they're picked up and taken away.
And the website is?
ACLUAK.org.
Thanks. On that point about payment, so if you're accused of a crime, we've seen it in movies, you know, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed. There is no court-appointed attorney for ICE detainees. Correct. So they have to pay for it themselves. And I'm assuming that most of them don't have a lot of money in the bank. So all of these folks would be reliant on having a pro bono attorneys just show up, or what do they do?
They either hope and pray that they can find a pro bono attorney, or they scramble and scrounge and try to get funding to support hiring an attorney. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it that's really important too is that many of the pathways to legal status, all of them require applications for status through ICE's sister organization, which is called Citizenship and Immigration Services. So if you want to apply for asylum, if you want to apply because you're married to a U.S. citizen, if you want to apply for a work permit, there are application fees that have been going up and up and up and up. And I don't know the latest dollar amounts for things, but I think what I recently heard is that an application for political asylum has gone from free to $1,000. People can't afford that either. And people are not allowed to work until after their application for asylum has been in for 5 months. Then they can apply for a work permit, which costs an additional amount of money. But up until then, they have no way to be working. So how can they afford to even submit the application? Not mentioning hiring an attorney to help them with the application.
Well, Mayor Kimmel, thank you so much for being on the show today.
That's great. Thank you.
If people want to learn more about this issue, can you recommend a website, a book, some place to go to just learn more?
I would recommend the American Immigration Council. They are a great organization that just keeps people updated on the current state of laws and what's happening and all of the changes. But they also have great information on states. And so you can go on the American Immigration Council's website and find out all about who is living in Alaska and what are the economic contributions that people are making and all of the different issues that face our state in particular. And they also then just have great links to other organizations. There's the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which also has good information. And then there's the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. There's the National Immigration Justice Project. There's a whole host of websites where you can go and not only learn about what's happening, but there's great resources on there if you or a family member is being impacted by the current administration's policies.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.